All right. Greetings, friends and comrades. Daniel Tutt here with Emancipations podcast. And I'm very, very honored to welcome Professor Steve Hall to the show. Steve, how are you today?
I'm fine. Into the evening here in good old Blighty, of course. But it's been quite a pleasant day. Spring is in the air.
Oh, very nice to hear, Steve. Well, we are here to discuss The Death of the Left, a book that came out in the last few years, written by Simon Winlow and yourself, Steve Hall. You are both academics based in the UK, sociology, anthropology, criminology, the social sciences. You live in this world. You have a kind of, I think, a multidisciplinary approach. And I was going to congratulate you on, as an academic, I was very impressed by all of these citations that you've accrued over your career. You are emeritus professor. So does that mean you're retired?
I'm retired. Yes, recommended.
Congratulations.
Yes. I can write what I want now, you see, Daniel, which is, well, not that they stopped me. We had quite a torrid time trying to push our ideas through in British academia over the past 30 plus years. But now I'm completely free to write what I want. And Simon's in quite a strong position, having a tremendous publication record. So we tend to sort of get our own way, which is a position we've fought and struggled for a very long time, and it's doable, but you've got to be pretty tough, and you make some enemies on the way. I'll tell you that.
So this book is a kind of manifesto. It's a history of the British left.
Yeah.
You even touch on the history of the American left. And the subtitle, I think listeners will appreciate the subtitle, which is The Death of the Left. That's the title. The subtitle is Why We Must Begin from the Beginning. We must begin again from the ground floor, so to speak. And in that sense, your argument is, and I want to summarize it and then kick it to you to sort of build off of it. But since I've just read it, I want to kind of give my overview and have you weigh in. So I think it's been a long-standing realization in recent decades that, on the one hand, the Thatcher neoliberal revolution has, brought about major political economic transformations. The rise of finance capital, the introduction of austerity, deindustrialization, the loss of the, manufacturing sector, all types of dislocation, alienation, and precarity have affected the working class globally, but in the West, in ways which really make us nostalgic for the welfare state, right? In a certain way, even though nostalgia for the welfare state is not advisable if you're a leftist, which is another thing we can talk about. But this is a natural reflex for people to feel some kind of nostalgia for what their grandparents were able to achieve, for example. And we also have, of course, the new left. We have the rise of a different form of leftism. We have, in the intellectual arena, the rise of discourses of postmodernism, which you touch upon. So we have a kind of confluence of dynamics that has resulted in a crisis and an emergency regarding the meaning of the left itself. Now, let me say a little proviso in my little opening thing here. As you probably know, Steve, there's a lot of ways to criticize the left from within the left that I think can be counterproductive, in the sense that they can produce a type of fracturing of solidarity. They can produce a type of essentialization. For example, in your book, you point out that those people on the left who emphasize culture tend to be middle class or upper middle class by background. But then you say that we should not somehow essentialize them. That's one thing I think that a lot of the critiques of the left from the left, they fall into that.
Yeah.
And I feel, Steve, what I like about your work is that you're sensitive to that, and you don't want to. You see, for me, I would much rather convince and forge a solidarity with the elements of the left who are counterculture. Even though for me, they might essentialize me as some kind of person who only cares about economic issues, for example. But even that binary is not a sufficient binary. So, anyways, I will stop and just kick it to you and tell us about the origins of this book, and maybe you can address some of these bigger questions about how one goes about criticizing the left from the left in a way that is productive.
Yeah, well, being productive at the moment is very difficult, we think, because we live in the era of what Mark Fisher called, I think he was drawing quite a lot on the work of Slavoj Žižek at the time when Žižek was producing some interesting ideas, fetishistic disavowal, etc. Perhaps less so these days. He's taken a bit of a liberal turn, I think, and in the course of recent events. But negative politics was incredibly destructive, and we end up with working people. Let's use the broad term working people for the time being, to cope with this notion of the middle class that we'll probably touch on later, who are basically voting for the least worst, and not just voting in elections, but thinking about the least worst type of politics, because what's happened in the past there's been some quite horrific events in the 20th century. And there's a feeling amongst the working people I knew, because I was born into the working class. My father was an industrial plumber, then a steel worker. I was laid into academia. I'd traveled the world a little bit. I'd been a journeyman musician. I'd been working in steelworks and coal mines. A bit of a tough guy when I was younger. I worked on the doors of nightclubs and as a bouncer even. I did all sorts of these jobs, saw life from that end of the spectrum. Since I was born into a fairly tough culture, a coal mining village in County Durham, the sort of equivalent of your Appalachian coal mining places, And I saw life. I knew what the people were like in generally speaking, very broadly speaking. Of course, there's lots of differences. There are huge differences in the way they saw the world and the way they acted in the world. But there are ways I found of persuading people to adopt a broad leftist stance, to even consider the left as a possibility, because what the French, I think the early French postmodernists and post-structuralists found, and we talk about this in our book quite a lot, after the riots in 1968, when they visited the workers in the fields and the Renault factories, they found quite a conservative group of people. Some of the things I've heard said about the workers from these left bank intellectuals, who some of them I'd heard in conferences and spoken to, it was quite eviscerating. It was quite harsh. Drunken Catholics and conservatives and stupid oafs and all this sort of thing, So there was this contempt for working people. There was a point at which, in the late 1960s, after the '68 revolution, this I think was manifested also in the counterculture and some of the things. Everyone from Ginsberg to the sort of hippie movement, there was a contempt for workers, which I think has driven populism, has driven this wedge that is creating, right-wing populism that we've seen emerge since the 2008 financial crisis, about which the left had no answer. Now, so we had this contempt, where the left bank intellectuals, Foucault, Pierre Victor, and all them as well as I do, saw the agents of history in a different guise. They saw anyone from prisoners to people, black people, Asians, women, anyone but the working class as the agents of history. And I think that was the initial fragmentary movement, which we have to contend with. And I think that moreover, I think that working people throughout the 70s and 80s detected that contempt. I saw that I heard that in things they were saying to me, in their faces, in their looks, in their gradual migration away from the left into the first port of call in that, of course, is right-wing Labour, and the British Labour Party has a very strong right-wing tradition. It goes back to the Methodists and the cooperative movement in the 1920s, for instance. The cooperative movement that was against the hunger marches, which you don't hear much about after the general strike in 1926. My grandfather, Joe Hall, another tough guy, was a miner who, in the 1920s, was a union leader, trying to unionize the miners, a very difficult job. And he's responsible for his chapter of miners from his village going down into the hunger marches in London, where it was in 1932, I think. Don't quote me. I think it was the 1932 march, where 100,000 hunger marchers faced down 60,000 police in pitched battles. You don't hear about that in 1932 in the country. It was a tough time, and it needed a tough politics. You always hear about the Jarrow March 4 years later, which was a relatively innocuous march of many shipyard workers from Jarrow and Newcastle down to London to ask for work. So we had this tough working class who had been used to a certain type of politics, tended to be culturally conservative. Most of them tended to be culturally conservative, quite religious. There were Protestant Catholic feuds going on the end of the 19th century in Britain through to the general strike. The general strike in 1926 brought the two factions together, the Protestant Catholic factions together, realized they had a common enemy, and those factional battles tended to stop. Now, when we use the word economic determinism and essentialism, I don't like these words, because I don't see the economy being some sort of separate option from culture and identity and colonial history and all the rest of it. I see economics are shared interests. If we don't get that right first, we don't convince working people that we're going to provide some sort of platform for their job security so they can pay rent, they pay their mortgages, bring up their kids, watch the football matches and do the things that they want to do and live their lives in the way, that we're never going to get anyone on side, and we're going to have to wait for some sort of collapse where the chips fall where they may, and we have to contend with the politics that rise up in that situation. God knows what that will be. They could be far right. We could have the accelerationist to Nick Land and his pals could be correct, that there could be some sort of calamity, some sort of catastrophe where the things fall apart, and we'll have to contend with the politics that rise up in that chaos. But to convince working people to even take part in the left, in any form, in the Labour Party, in communist parties, in even voting for the left has been very, very difficult since 1968, and that turn towards. Now, I don't like to call this the cultural turn, because the cultural turn was something that happened much earlier, with the writings of people like Richard Crossland and Stuart Hall, who took over the New Left Review editorship in 1960, parachuted in just after his PhD. Very nice for him. And this was a shift towards culture, because after Khrushchev's so-called secret speech in 1956, when he revealed some of the horrors of Stalinism, the left reacted, didn't it? I mean, you won't remember this, but I sort of caught the back end of the reaction of this, because I'm an old geezer, as you probably guessed by now. I caught the back end of that reaction in the 1960s and 70s. The horror, the horrific. We are not Stalinists. We want nothing to do with that. Of course, then the realization, books coming out by people like Alec No, very good economists, who warned us about the problems in the central command economy of the Soviet Union, Gosplan, which simply didn't work. It didn't work very well. I think it was a miracle it worked at all. And you had an office block in Moscow trying to plan what everyone in every town and village in that vast territory wants to buy on a Saturday morning for their lunch. It's just, what a stressful, incredibly stressful job that must have been. Yeah, I mean, I've heard of suicides, administrators just committing because they just could not do that job. You need markets, which they tried. The new economic policy for the first 4 or 5 years after the Civil War was working. And all left-wing economists who know what they're talking about, and I've got a pretty good grasp of economics and economic history, I think more so than a lot of my comrades on the left, I have to say that. Most people, most economically literate people are realizing now that we must have markets. God, the Chinese have realized that in a big way, and they're motoring ahead in incredible speed. You need markets, but you don't want market power oligarchs running politics, and the Chinese have managed to keep them out of the political sphere. You use their innovation, they're quite ruthless, some Chinese businessmen in a lot of ways, dealing with other people in other countries, but use that dynamism, that innovation to stir up economic activity, but control it closely, democratically. I mean, people call China an authoritarian state, but the Chinese Communist Party has 3,000 members who represent the autonomous zones and the locales, and they've had to work their way through local politics and prove they can do some good before they get into the party. So it sort of works. Everything's imperfect, but it sort of works for the time being. So convincing people that this fragmentation was going to take them anywhere that they wanted to go, this fragmented world of identity politics, and this fragmented culture. Because, like I say, the cultural turn happened before that, and it was a different movement. But this fragmented cultural turn, I think, was incredibly difficult because they seemed to immediately regard others as competitors. As the economy sank down after the deindustrialization in the 1980s, that was horrific. I'm from the north of England, which relied on steelworks, shipyards, coal mining, all this sort of stuff. Middlesbrough is a place, I used to work at the university there, was known as the infant Hercules in the early 20th century. Huge industries dormant along the world's biggest bridge builders, for instance, massive employment, and good wages. People were having a reasonable sort of time of it. Some of the jobs were quite tough. I know that. I've done some of them. They were quite tough jobs, but they were having a reasonable time of things. They could see a future. Now, just this by talking about nostalgia, I get a little bit irritated on this idea of nostalgia. We tend to think of it as a harking back to a static time in the past. And now Simon got a bit fed up with all of that as well. Wrote another book called sorry, I forgot the name. It's The Politics of Nostalgia. Sorry. And he interviewed dozens of people. Simon, as well as a good theorist, is a brilliant ethnographer. He listens to what people say, interprets it so well. And he realized very quickly that nostalgia isn't about harking back to the past. It's about harking back to a time in the past when the future looked different.
Right.
It's harking back to a trajectory where you think, okay, things are going to move, and they're going to move in a certain way, and it looks as though we're going to get a ride on them. We're going to get a ride. Right. And that was the difference. So it's not wanting to go back to the past of colonialism and racism and sexism and all of this cultural horror that was going on in the 50s.
Right.
Still going on in the 50s and 60s. It's going back to a time when things looked like they were getting better. We're going to go better on a better trajectory. Race Relations Act 1970. Was improving. It was starting to improve and get rid of racism. The National Front, the awful far-right party in Britain, was falling apart in the 1970s. We were making progress, and it's going back to that feeling of progress, of things are getting better. I think what nostalgia is about. Amongst these people he interviewed, anyway, I don't know what the aristocracy think about nostalgia, how they think of it. I don't.
Well. I have a question.
Yeah.
You had mentioned cultural conservatism of the working class. Now, you take somebody like Adorno and Horkheimer, and they did the authoritarian personality studies, and they, in the 50s, they showed that, the working class was, not only did they associate the rise of the Nazis with the working class being complicit with that, but they also then later, after the war, tried to argue that really the working class has a propensity towards authoritarianism. And now, I was wondering, in all of your research in social science, criminology, etc., empirical research that you've done, have you encountered work that disputes?
Oh, without a doubt, yeah.
This, because that's my assumption, and I've never trusted it. I've never
No, I think
trusted the frame, the kind of presentation of that argument. And I would even question this idea that the working class is somehow inevitably conservative. I don't buy it. What is
well,
what can you say about that?
I think it's conservative by default in the absence of anything that will make them not conservative. And that's our problem. And that's why the left died, because we couldn't do that. They're conservative in the sense that, as I've just explained, that they look back towards something that appeared to be moving towards something better at the time. If that's conservatism, let's call it conservatism. Some of them, of course, brought up in religious households, Catholic, Protestant, Anglican, whatever. And there is an inherent conservatism, especially in Protestant religion, even though they regarded themselves as radicals 400 years ago. It's now seen as, especially in American culture, Protestantism as seen as the part of their revolution, and all of that. But I think that, what does the authoritarian personality mean? That doesn't mean anything to me. I mean, that the Freudianism he used was so cack-handed and awful. I don't think that, you see, authoritarian personality is Theodor's fear. That's all it is. It's his fear. And social science has been built on the back of that fear since the 1950s, which was, of course, exacerbated by Stalinist revelations, and then the Cultural Revolution and the the Red Guards and all the rest of it gave them another excuse to be terrified. The left are a bunch of frightened pussies, and they always have been. They're terrified. They're terrified of authoritarianism. But the problem is that the authoritarianism that they are frightened of is a result of their own failure. And let's take this back to the 1920s. Just bear with me 1 second. I know you want to get in there, but let's just to give you an example of what I'm talking about. Despite de Sturmer and all of this authoritarian working class complicity in Nazism from 1921, when it started to catch on, 2 years later, Norbert Elias, a theorist we always used to argue hotly with, and I think we have a better conception of what Western civilization is. He called it the civilizing process. If you remember Elias's work, we call it the pseudo-pacification process. We think it's something totally different. He saw his friend murdered by the Free Corps in 1923. And we looked on this terrible working class. But in 1928, the Nazis got 2.8% of the vote. I mean, the Conservatives in this country, in the Newsom by-election, have just done worse than that. They got 1.9% of the vote, which is it's their hope, I mean, I don't know. It was quite incredible. The results just came out this morning. And they got 2.8% of it. So despite de Sturmer and all of this ideology and the authoritarian personality, whatever that means, nothing happened. A few years later, in 1933, well, what happened the year after was the Wall Street crash. The left in Germany was divided, if you remember, between this social sort of Democrats and the communists, all arguing with each other in the cafes. And I bet those arguments were very interesting. And I bet they whiled away the hours until 2 o'clock in the morning, arguing about technical issues, about philosophical issues. And I wish I'd been there, because I'm sure it was being I still do enjoy that. But that's just pleasure, really, isn't it? It's not getting anywhere. What happened was, outside of that, people were bloody starving, There was no welfare state. and the absolute immiseration. I think it was Gramsci who coined that term. Correct me if I'm wrong. We're talking about that period of the absolute immiseration of German workers, and that's how Hitler scraped in. Don't forget, he scraped in 1933. It wasn't a landslide. So that 4 years did the trick. There was nothing before that. The Nazis were getting nowhere before that. Now, this is what economists know, and this is why I sometimes think that the left don't like delving into the relationship between economics and politics, because it reveals things they don't really want to think about. And that economics is so important to working people, that platform. Give them a stable platform. There are two ways they can, the two ways the working class people can rebel, either in chaos and misery, in which case their rebellion is difficult to predict, the shape and direction of their rebellion, or on a stable platform, they can gain confidence, they can create unions, they can create political parties, and they can start to do it incrementally. And I know you'll be sitting there saying, "Oh, bloody hell, he's a social democrat. He's just a weak." Maybe I am. I'm nothing, actually. I call ourselves teleological pragmatists. And how do we get where we want to go? That's all we're interested in. And how do we change things for the better, given the situation we have right now? But I don't think that this authoritarian personality, I think that was simply a personal fear. Perfectly understandable. Look, he was Jewish. Look what happened to Jewish people in the 1940s. Of course, the whole oeuvre is based on that deep fear that eats into them, eats into their culture. And I don't think it actually existed. I think there are far more rational, understandable, a causal context. Let's not call them simple causes, but a causal context in which that happened. I don't think it can happen again very soon.
Right.
Things get tremendously bad. Things have got to get really bad for anything like that to happen. Even reform in Britain and even the MAGA crowd in America are not of that. Yeah, they're not that
Right.
MAGA.
Right. Well, I will respond by saying I agree with you, first of all. And I also, to my recollection, Adorno's methodology was flawed as well.
Awful.
Yeah.
And I say that as a professional. It was just the most, I would have failed that as a PhD.
Really? Wow.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Now, I think another thing to note is when we say authoritarian or conservative, what's the benchmark by which we're making that judgment? Because if you take somebody like Stuart Hall, he had this idea that I find very compelling, where he argued that what the 1970s shift in capitalism brings about is what he called authoritarian populism.
Populism, yeah.
That's his concept. Remember that? No, I thought it was an interesting point.
Yeah.
What he argued was that a lot of social antagonisms in society are given permission to be expressed through what he called moral panics, kind of what we now call the culture wars.
Yeah.
Now, within that context, the working class, because their interests are not represented by the bourgeoisie, they will appear more conservative because a lot of the conflagrations of what politics represents, it's kind of artificial. It's kind of been manufactured. It's not something which has true bearings on their lives. It's not going to determine anything that would address their deeper needs at all. Not at all. And in that sense, they may appear more conservative because when they take a position on a culture war issue, they're doing it as a resistance to the conditions that have been imposed upon them.
Yeah.
Does that make sense to you? How do you analyze that?
It does. I don't think it's a rational or thought through resistance. I think it's a visceral resistance. A dislike, a fear. But there's so much fear around. You've opened up the liberal left's black box here, Daniel. The wreck is on the ground, and you've found the black box here. In the black box, moral panic is one of the most important issues in the dead left's, crashed left's black box. It has an interesting history. We can trace it back. An Irish friend of mine argues with me that it actually predates this, but you can trace it back in this country, in my country, in England, to 1831, when a French physician, I don't know why they were using a French physician. I don't know. Probably some relationship they had with. I have no idea. But the British administrators were using a French physician in the north of England to investigate a cholera outbreak in a place called Sunderland. You might have heard of the football team in Sunderland. Simon's from Sunderland. He's a Sunderland lad, and I'm from Newcastle along the road. We support rival football teams, which is very, very great for a little bit of banter. So the cholera outbreak, and the French physician coined the term. We think, unless it was, unless it had been used before, he might have simply stolen it. But he said, we don't want to tell them they've got cholera because there might be a moral panic. So here we have the origin of the term used in exactly the same way, coming from an establishment right-wing authority. So it's the authority that they're afraid of is using the term moral panic, which inverts the whole thing. So its beginning was an inversion of Stanley Cohen. Stanley Cohen and Jock Young, who are both now, Stanley Cohen and I used to argue terrible arguments and conferences about this sort of thing. Jock Young, who were working in criminology with two social scientists working within the sort of broad criminological field, who didn't want anyone in the 70s to know that, or the 80s when there was a crime explosion. They didn't want anyone to know about that crime explosion in case there was a moral panic, and they would vote in an authoritarian government and bring back Hitler or someone, I don't know, which wouldn't have happened, of course, but it's a very stupid position, this. But let's just bear with me a minute on this. So fast forward to the 1960s, and it crosses the floor into the arena of the anarcho sort of left anarchist Stanley Cohen, who hated all forms of authority, government, which gives the left a libertarian hue. So this is the counterculture, was injecting this sort of American libertarianism into the sort of Ginsburg, Frank Zappa libertarianism into the left at the time, which was, again, I think, a corrosive influence. And he said that don't talk about crime, don't let the media exaggerate, don't believe the media. Otherwise, you'll vote the Conservatives, and the Conservatives have got Enoch Powell, a guy called Enoch Powell, who was a racist, and he'll throw all black people out of the country, and they'll do terrible things. This was sociology at the most banal and basic level. It was quite unbelievably simplistic. And Stuart later coined the term authoritarian populism. Now, I argued with him at conferences about that, and I was condemned as a racist because you can't argue with Stuart Hall, you see. I've never actually been a racist, but I was condemned as a racist simply for arguing against him, against this notion of authoritarian populism. So then...
Can I ask a question?
Hang on, just let me finish this. Hang on, bear with me for 1 minute. So fast forward to a few weeks ago, and Richard Hanania, your American... wing liberty is using the term moral panic to stop the absurd expansion of the Jeffrey Epstein scandal. As we see people going completely over the top about this, talking about cannibals and submarines and the island and all the rest of it. So it's crossed the floor again to the right. So it's a multi-purpose concept. Now, we can't really say that in that case it belongs to the left. Its fact can be used by anyone. And all it is fear. Again, it's a fear of something they don't like. And it's a paranoid fear that something they hate might emerge if they perform a certain set of actions and if they believe a certain set of symbols, promoted by the mass media or whatever. It's just a very, very unreliable concept. And I don't think it has any grounding in the way that people think about the world or do their politics. I really don't. And I think it's something we've written about this in a book called Revitalizing Criminal. We've written about this at length. And I think it's one of the concepts in the black box that we need to boot out. If we ever make new aeroplane and get the thing flying again, which I hope we do very, very soon, because things are going to get a bit tough over the next few years economically. Even Mark Carney realizes that, his last speech, even the Liberals are starting to worry. If the Liberals are starting to worry, we should certainly start worrying. I'm quite pally with a guy called Steve Keen, an economist who predicted the 2008 financial crisis. And he's a much better economist than I am. He's a proper economist, of course. And I get a bit of advice from him now and again. And I think we're heading for very, very rocky financial waters at the moment. And things are going to get quite tough. Something that Ajun Chang predicted about 20 years ago. So I'm sorry to cut you off there, but I just wanted to stress that this moral panic is just a multi-purpose paranoid notion that really goes nowhere and has no bearing on the reality of life at all.
My question is the problem with the concept, authoritarian populism, moral panic, is the problem a kind of anxiety? It projects an anxiety over this kind of similar problem we saw with Adorno and the authoritarian personality. Is it kind of a repetition of a similar tendency?
It's a politicized, socialized, broadened repetition of his sort of atomized notion of it. It was a psychological notion. So this is
Right.
Adorno writ large. We don't want that, honestly. It was bad enough having.
So one other question. So then the practical, let's say, effects of this concept mean that the working class is conservative. It's therefore, it almost ontologizes them as such. They cannot really be changed. And therefore, their attraction to the right is a sign of creeping fascism or something like this.
Always.
And tell me why that is a problem. Well, I agree with you. I'm on your side here. But speak to the person who is more convinced of Stuart Hall's position. Yeah. Can you articulate why it's wrong or why it's flawed?
I think so. I think that there are a number of reasons, but let me just home in on what I think is the major reason for a moment, which is the unfortunate. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, or even worse, than a sort of iatrogenic sort of process where the left's actions make things a lot worse. Doctor's problems. You perform a bad operation and the patient nearly dies, even though he wasn't going to die when he went in or when she went in. So what happens, and what we watched happen, I've watched closely, both from the vantage point of being brought up in the working class, even though I sort of hopped off to become a journeyman musician during the 1970s. And from an academic position, using a lot of research, a lot of ethnographic interview work, is that it creates the problem itself. And there are two reasons for that. One was a concept we use in our ultra-realists. We have this movement called ultra-realism, which is, it can't talk about that today. It's very broad, very complex, but we call it objectless anxiety. What happens, we think, is that the liberalized left, because this was a liberalization process, this is what we saw happening from the 60s, dismisses the working class or working people's real concerns, because it's the safer option. If they really acknowledge their concerns, that might lead to authoritarian populism. So the fear of acknowledging their concerns even prevents the left doing, and they feel, the working class feel as though they're not being listened to, and they feel as though they're being dismissed. There was a crime explosion in the 1980s. Okay, the left just deny this, or they're saying, "Yeah, well, okay, but crime doesn't do much harm." It was a crime explosion. When the north of England, I lived amongst it, when the north of England deindustrialized, Daniel, in the 1980s, criminal markets moved into the pit villages. We call this the county lines movement of drug operations working in the cities, moving out into villages. And a lot of these drugs were just ruining young people's lives. It wasn't hip anymore. It wasn't like hip students taking, smoking a bit of weed. This was all sorts of stuff coming in, high strength, class A stuff, destroying communities, destroying families. But young kids were getting involved in crime, usually petty crime, a lot of car theft going on, what's called car ringing, chopping cars in half and selling the bits and things, going on all over the place. And I worked with young offenders as a musician in the 1980s, trying to convince some of them to learn to play an instrument rather than steal cars, which was a bit of a tough ask in some places. They steal the guitar first, probably, then they might have got them interested. But there was an explosion of this stuff. Yeah, a lot of it wasn't, in the semiological sense, wasn't incredibly harmful, but it was ruining communities. It was getting kids locked up, put on probation, and ruining their chances of even the few jobs in the service industry, the insecure jobs that were replacing the more secure industrial jobs that were going. So it was ruining everyone's chances. Crime explosion. A few criminologists and sociologists, honest ones, people like Robert Reiner, Dick Hobbs, people I know very well, Jock Young, people that called themselves left realists, were saying, look, there is a crime explosion. Deal with it. This is what's going on. Let's have the economics and the politics we need to repair this damage, to provide a platform where young people can get reasonable jobs and stop them drifting into criminal. That was the intelligent thing to do. But no, the left no.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
Can we articulate why the left is refusing to acknowledge the reality of in this case, this example? I think you could maybe identify others. My assumption, and share your view here, is that it's like you said, self-fulfilling prophecy, also because if we acknowledge that there is a crime epidemic, we then open Pandora's box of the right wing, who will then punish people,
put everyone in jail.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So
basically, yeah.
Okay. That is there a kind of psychological mechanism that accounts for this irrational relationship to the specter of the right? How do you theorize that precise hyperbole or exaggeration, or what's going on with that?
Well, you did it quite well yourself about 5 or 10 minutes ago when you reminded me of this automatic assumption that the working class are going to get into bed with the far right. And that assumption has been with us for a very long time, not just since the Weimar Republic, but since the troubles in the 19th century, for instance, between immigrant workers and the workers who've been there 10 years compared to the workers who just come, this wave of immigrants into America in the early 20th century, for instance. We had that wave, 50 to 100 years before that, particularly during the Irish potato famine, when the awful colonialists had monocropped Ireland, stupidly monocropped Ireland, and caused this huge, this awful mess. And we had a lot of Irish immigrants. Those Irish immigrants were strike breakers, and they were undercutting the wages. They couldn't do anything else. This is capitalism forcing working people into these awful competitive relations in a labour market. You could argue we just don't want a market in labour. We shouldn't have a market in labour, but that's for an economics argument we can have another time. But what happens is that because capitalism itself is so insecure and has become more insecure since over the past 40 years during the neoliberal era, it's become very, very insecure. We talk to Americans who are doing 4 or 5 jobs every day in order to pay their rent. It's quite horrendous down at the bottom end. Even the computer techies, the Silicon Valley techies, are complaining about insecurity and wondering about their jobs, and now that AI might be sort of taking over, etc. It creates what we call objectless anxiety. We use the term objectless anxiety. and this is a product again of capitalist realism, because we think we can't change anything, and because we brought up over the past 40 years to believe that. Francis Fukuyama put it in the most famous terms, the end of history, didn't he, in the early 1990s. So many people believe, look, this is as good as it gets, just get on with it, and don't be wussy, just get a job and get on with it. And so many people, probably an electoral majority, actually believe that. And so they believe in surviving in a very, very insecure environment. So you've got to imagine, it's all right for us, isn't it? With our contracts. Have you got one, or Daniel? Have you got a full-time contract over there in America at your university?
Well, no, I don't have a full-time. No.
So you're feeling a bit of it yourself,
Sure. Oh yeah.
Yeah, you're feeling this insecurity. So by removing the object, now people, anxiety hasn't got an object, people will say, and we'll agree with that. So yeah, the anxiety fear is anxiety plus an object. Yeah, anxiety is a feeling there's something wrong out there, but we don't know what it is. Fear, once you see it, there it is. Yeah, that anxiety morphs into fear. Fear is more healthy because you can see something. As long as you know what you're afraid of, then you start deal with it. But because neoliberalism never reveals itself, you will get neoliberals who say there's no such thing as neoliberalism. There's the sort of Milton Friedman, term. Then they can't see the object of their fear. But the problem is, since 1968, the left has colluded in that. The left has said, no, we can't change capitalism, apart from a few hardline leftists, communists, and others on the fringes. Yeah, let's be honest, on the fringes. You and I are on the fringes, apart from us and a few other people, because I still got myself as pretty hardline leftist of the old school, but based on economic change and class struggle, etc. Because we deny that, and the left is now, to use Nancy Fraser's term, do you remember, progressive neoliberalism? We're right. Progressive neoliberals. We can't really change anything because that creates more authoritarianism. We will get Stalin coming back. Again, the fear of authoritarianism comes back into the picture again. We can't do anything about it. Therefore, working people in general, including can't. Well, you can because you think about it all the time, but other people don't. They're too busy doing other things, So they can't see the object of their fear. So that leaves a vacuum in which ideology can place other objects of fears because it's so easy. It's immigrants, it's trans people, it's women, it's whatever. Right. But we have colluded in creating that vacuum.
And I feel as if the subtitle of your book is so nice, of starting again. Yeah. And you talk a lot about E.P. Thompson, and I will confess I disagree when you call him a liberal Marxist, because I think you're bringing in that kind of Althusserian anti-humanist distinction, and you say, well, because he's a humanist, he's not a materialist. But my response would be that you can be both.
Yeah, well, I agree.
Okay, I think, but that's a side point. But okay. let me. But I have a deeper question here.
Yeah,
which is Thompson talked a lot about class formation and the kind of the stuff that needs to happen before you have that in itself, for itself, or class consciousness. Because I think it's a bit cart before the horse, or premature to talk about class consciousness now. We don't have the institutions to facilitate it, right? But E.P. Thompson seems to be talking about the kind of more original beginning again of how you begin to formulate a conception of thinking about our subjectivity along class lines. That I think is interesting, because what you say is correct, that the 68 left has, unbeknownst to itself, participated in a thinking of subjectivity that is individualist. So how does one start to go back to the beginning, and what can E.P. Thompson teach us about that?
Okay, well, let me try to answer that one. First, I hope you don't think this sounds too harsh, but I didn't think E.P. Thompson was much of teachers at all, because I think that his original notions in the making of the English working class, planting the liberty tree and all of this, was about the moral economy. This idea that there's this moral force out there against capitalism, against land enclosure, against all commercialization, commodification, all of the things the Marxists talk about quite rightly, using his better concepts, talk about. We have historically, because we're economic and cultural historians too, probably not very good ones, I don't know, but let's we're just opening up. We're opening up channels of investigation. We have a point of investigation where we're the sort of crime scenes, Well, let's go back and take another look. We think that moral economy died in the 12th, 13th century in England, Europe, and of course America, which was just Europe abroad, wasn't it, for a good while. We think that died a long time ago. When the distributors projects, they were real distributors projects. I know conservatives, quite interesting conservatives like Hilaire Belloc, G.K. Chesterton talked about Catholic distributism in the early 20th century. But these were actually real distributors policies, which, well, let's call them policies. They were just attempts to try to stop people cheating each other and creating monopoly power in local markets, right? By just saying, look, you've got enough rabbits, don't bring any more. Let this other guy come and have a stall and sell some rabbits as well. Yeah,
right.
So these were trying to reorganize markets at the very root ground level. They didn't last, of course, especially after the plague when all of this landline followed, but also the introduction of the laws of primogeniture throughout the social structure in the 12th century. Alan Fall, an Oxford historian, talks about this, atomized the family and the community. It turned them into competitors, because if the firstborn is due the estate, then they're going to try to curry the parents' favour, even if they have dementia or something. They're going to curry the parents' favour and compete with the siblings. The siblings thought, oh, bugger this, we can't compete. Let's move out. And you got this it fueled the urbanization, atomization process from the 12th century onwards. The moral economy, when E.P. Thompson, Edward, was talking about the little dabblers and the diggers in the 70s, this was 500 years too late. The thing had gone already. And we have this. So when we say we have to begin from the beginning again, we're making a much bigger statement. We're saying we have to begin from the historical beginning again. This is historical.
And for that, you identify the early industrial period, right? Yeah. But I guess, E.P. Thompson. So are you suggesting that E.P. Thompson is a bit anachronistic in his, even in his treatment of the modern industrial capitalist period?
It's a term, I would use the term naive.
Really?
Yeah, I think it's very naive to believe that there was this moral core to working class communities and working class life. The levelers and the diggers and Jared Winstanley were just tiny minorities. There was only a handful of people thinking like that. Most working people, for instance, I come from Newcastle upon Tyne. Oh, well, I don't actually. I come from a county, Durham Pid village, but I live in Newcastle upon Tyne now. Beautiful little city. We were called Geordies. We're called Geordies. Quite famous people come from, people like Mark Knopfler, Sting, people like that come from Newcastle, and they have this burr that, their accent is hearing in me. And we have a very unique culture. We were called Geordies. We think, now there's the jury's out on this, because we were supporters of King George and the Church and King mobs. The Church and King mobs, during early industrialization, very late 18th, early 19th century, were conservative mobs who violently attacked early attempts at unions and Luddites and people who were resisting.
You were scabs.
We were horrible scabs. Well, not all of us, but enough of us to cause fights on the town moor. And we're a tough lot, and we're quite good at fighting, a lot of us. That was culture that I was born into. And we were known as Geordies because of this not just a conservative bent, but a fairly active and committed conservative belief in the church and the king. We were royalists. We were royalist scabs, even worse than scabs, So we have this conservative culture that we have to somehow defeat. So I think that Edward Thompson and other Marxist historians, Chris Hill and the whole gang, who were tended to be upper middle class, Daniel. I mean, Edward was the son of the local bourgeois, I think it was bakeries, Cheney owned or something like that, who don't know the working class and don't know how difficult it is going to be to actually change. That element of conservatism, although it was far more attenuated in the 1960s, it wasn't as bad as that, Well, I don't know. I mean, I haven't done any interviews with people, and it wasn't as bad as that. But that's what we've got to fight. That's what we've got to beat. That's quite a tough conservative strand in working class culture. We talked about that in the book, this sort of affinity between the working people and the aristocracy at race meetings, for instance. They feel themselves as part of the same community almost, We're all betting on the horses. That is incredibly difficult. There's a lot of that in America. There's a lot of that in Europe. So when we say we have to begin from the beginning, we don't have these malleable people to work with, We have beliefs that they have at the moment, that combine these old conservative cultural beliefs are combined with neoliberal beliefs about the state, currency issue, public investment, inflation, everything. If we publicly invest and if we nationalize industries, if we give everyone a job, it will cause inflation. Yeah, that's it. So the neoliberal economic beliefs are now twinned with these old, hopefully attenuated conservative beliefs, and we have a tough nut to crack. The left has got no idea what it's playing with here, what it's trying to deal with. This is what we're trying to say. And we're saying that from a position of individuals who know the working class. Now, thank God there are some working class radicals who move in, a lot of go through the university system, they read Marx and they read, well, I don't know, who would it be? I won't give you my recommendations right now. We may talk about that later. But read some quite radical. They're radicalized. They get some radical ideas, and a lot of them know what they're up against. They know what we have to do. But there's no pliable, malleable putty to work with out there. We have a tough job, and to do that tough job, I think we must get down to economic basics, shared interests, and convince working people that we can make things better for them. Yeah.
Right. Well, I appreciate that. I didn't see your portrayal of E.P. Thompson totally negative, but I do take your point of the moralistic element, which is a problem. But the other reason you say begin again is more contemporary, which is we went through Corbyn, we went through Sanders. You say in the book that left populism is dead, and I agree completely. Yeah. And we went through Brexit. And these events showed, what did they show? That's my question. What did they show about the continual problem of the left and the working class, this kind of dialectic? How did it, what does it indicate? And because of course in the United States, which you touch on a bit, we really have been talking a lot about the question about how to position working class interests outside of the Democratic Party, because it has such a hegemony. Yeah. And there's a question about Socialist Party, how to do that. What do you think, for example, of your party right now in the UK? What do you think about a post-Corbyn situation? Politically speaking, do you have any signs for optimism, or what's your general diagnosis?
I'm not immediately optimistic. No, your party is a mess. There was a power struggle between Sultana and Corbyn, which Corbyn sort of won because he's the old hand and he knows how to win these struggles, and Zara doesn't. So there's a power struggle again, and identity politics, identitarianism rubbing up against the working classes' economic interests, and because Corbyn is basically economically illiterate. I can tell you a story about John MacDonald and some very famous economists I know who tried to convince the early Corbyn government, in the early Corbyn movement in 2016, to adopt a different economic stance, to convince people that they could actually make the British economy better and start providing some jobs, some services, get the National Health Service back on its feet, and all of the things that working class people are interested in. If you look at the polls, working class concerns, number one, cost of living. National Health Service, schools education, jobs, they don't care about any of these cultural issues. They're economically anxious. It's because of the economic condition of insecurity in which they live. So Corbyn and Sanders made a big mess of that in 2016 by capitulating to the identitarian calls. And they lost touch with the economic issues at hand after the great financial crash in 2008 had made the Western nations incredibly insecure because of the austerity programs that were forced on them by the neoliberals and the institutions, the IMF and the money markets and the private equity, the investment class, what Michael Hudson calls the creditor class. It's now they're very, very tough people who we need to take on. And, we don't understand. The left doesn't understand finance very well. Some amongst us do, and it's good to get in touch with these people. But to convince the left that we need a different economic approach is very, very difficult. So what happened was that recently, if you read Ha-Joon Chang's tremendous work from the early 2000s, is that the nations of the world got rich enough to sustain a decent standard of living for the populations by three things: capital controls, number one, keeping capital in their country; tariffs, I'm sorry, I know Trump's making an awful mess of them because he's not very clever, but that's a different matter. And subsidies for essential industries, public services. I mean, in America, your infrastructure is falling to pieces, isn't it? A bridge falling down, railway lines bent, trains can't get along the railway lines. It's in a bit of a mess, public infrastructure. China has employed all of these strategies in order to protect itself. So what's happening now is we're moving towards protectionism economically as a matter of course, because it's the only way out. We're moving back towards protectionism. That is a bit scary. It's far more scary than authoritarian populism, whatever that means. We're moving back towards now. The twin of cultural accompaniment to protectionism is nationalism. So we're moving back towards nationalist sentiments. How do we protect ourselves in a hostile global environment, which is incredibly hostile? Because, of course, other countries are competing for manufacturing, export and import trade relationships are in flux at the moment. I know Mark Carney's just signed a huge deal with China, exchanging agricultural products for electric vehicles. And Trump's hopping up and down mad, because he doesn't understand why this is happening. That Carney's trying to repair these international relationships outside of the sort of blocks in which things were starting to move towards. So we're in a very, very difficult situation. The left must convince people, without moving back to nationalism, without moving back to hostile, aggressive nationalism, that it can repair or the platform on which people stand. It must convince people of that. If it doesn't convince people of that, then it will simply foment further cultural antagonisms, competition between individuals and cultural groups over the diminishing opportunities for jobs and incomes and livelihoods. AI, will that, the jury's out on that, will that eat into professional jobs? Will we be having AI robot dentists, and will AI take over from lawyers? It would probably make a better job of the last lawyer I employed a few years ago. I know that, but I'm not sure whether it will replace them entirely. But it certainly will eat into the professional administrative class. India, rather than build on the industrialism of the licence Raj era pre-1991, before the economic problems hit, the finance problems hit, it made the mistake of putting all its eggs in the basket of tech services. Basically, it's a giant customer services office, and AI will eat into those jobs because it doesn't have the tech innovation in the manufacturing, industrial, and design innovation that other China and America have. So we're in an incredibly difficult global situation. The left must have answers. It must start talking about how to take on what I call money market power, the bond markets, the FX currency traders who can depreciate your currency, an import-dependent country like the UK. All of a sudden, all of these businesses depend on a strong pound so they can buy lots of stuff in. They'll go bust, and your government will be out in 6 months. It'll be gone. Yeah, just like, remember Liz Truss a couple of years ago? Right. Lasted 40 days because she scared the bond markets. The bond markets are just a sheepdog. They're relatively innocuous. It's the forex markets. $9.5 trillion a day traded on forex markets. $9.5 trillion. Just sit and think about that for a second. This is how much power they have. They sell up your currency, drop your currency, can't afford your imports, your government's gone. So we need capital controls. We need fixed rate bonds. Why do we give? Bonds are savings accounts. We can trace them back to the Rialto money markets in 11th century Venice, where they had to pay a bond to the Doge because the merchant adventuring nonsense was always going wrong and they owed people money, so they had to pay a bond. That was inverted in the 17th century, first the Netherlands, and then, of course, the Dutch Empire, the East India Company, and then the British East India Company. Right. Giving their reserve capital to the government because it was the safest place to put it, because the banking system was a chaotic mess and banks were going bust every day. Right. To the government. And let me just finish this. So we are beholden to a market, a bond market, a secondary market that buys bonds, which are simply savings accounts given by the government to big capital. Why do we have bond markets to tell us what to do? People don't understand what they are. If we understood what they are, we could simply beat them, and we could beat them off. We need international agreement. We need, hopefully, socialist governments in the States eventually, maybe moving through social democratic stages towards socialism, which I think was probably a better way to do it. But we need to be able to take on these money markets, the market discipline that prevents our economies from pulling themselves off the ground. If we don't do that, then we're going to see the drift to far-right populism. And I'm afraid that's going to be quite inevitable.
I want to ask you about your views on the Labour Party as a vehicle for delivering on social democratic promises, because I do think that the Leninist position on social democracy is an interesting one, insofar as one of, you could say, Lenin's main points, and even before him, Kautsky, right, was that you have to also have a revolutionary socialist dimension of the struggle, because left unto itself, social democracy will hit a wall of limit. The ruling class will not hand over the reins of the system. It won't work that way. It just won't. It never has. Even if you have the most competent managers, technicians, economists, strategists, you name it, it's never going to work that way. So I want your thoughts on that Leninist point, because I think there's a bit of there's a kind of anti-dialectical way of looking at Lenin's point that people have, because they think that, well, we don't need social democracy, all we need is the vanguard party. No, Lenin said you need both. I think both. Go ahead.
Yes, I think Lenin was right. I think he was right about, we can't employ Lenin's economic policies. As you know, we tried to inflate away capitalism. Now you can do that after a civil war when everyone's on the ground anyway, and has been accustomed to that degree of suffering. And Russia, I don't know how many people know this, but it's the only independent, self-sufficient material resource economy territory in the world. So it always has been. It's been incredibly self-sufficient. So you could do things like inflate away capitalism in Russia because you had that material resource base to your hand all of the time. As this was happening, Britain was running out of coal. And it hadn't discovered North Sea. Oh, that ran out very, very quickly. Britain is a burnt out, exhausted, post-colonial hulk with no sails sailing on a stormy sea. It's not Russia in 1921 after the Civil War, or in 1917 during the Revolution. We desperately need. I would love a revolution tomorrow. I mean, I'm 70-year-old. I don't know how much use I would be. I used to be quite tough, and I've got a bean to cup coffee machine. I could make coffee and try to keep people awake when they're on watch at the barricades. I could make myself some use. I'd love to see it happen. That's not going to happen because, again, working class conservatism, the power of ideology, the media, and the welfare state's making people reasonably comfortable. Not all people, certainly. Even though they're insecure, they're comfortably insecure, which is an awful position to be in. It's a paradox, but it seems to sort of keep most people on side. So that the revolution is not going to happen. I wish it would, but it won't happen. So we were desperate for that social democratic stage that we go through. And during that stage, the last one was Keynesianism. I think this one should be post-Keynesianism. I think the post-Keynesian economists have better answers because they understand the currency issuing state, the causes of inflation, the system dynamics approaches are much better at understanding how markets work, etc. We need that stage in order that the left can keep its promises.
Right.
If can't keep promises, then people say, good. And you last a term. Yeah, we must be able to make some promises that we can keep.
Right.
In order to make promises that we can keep that actually mean something. So there must be substantive promises too, Daniel, not just airy-fairy,
Sure.
Ban fox hunting and all of this sort of stuff. We're talking about real.
What do they call it? Fully automated luxury communism.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, let's. The contrarian Marxists and all the rest of them can. We don't need all that spiked online. All that's what we need are promises that we can keep. We've got to get people on side. What can we do with substantive promises? We need capital controls. We need public investment. We need. Let's start with Thames Water. Now, you can tell me about some American stuff that you can start putting right, but in this Thames Water is a nightmare. It's going into the river. People's water bills are going up. It's owned by.
Is that gotten worse after Brexit?
Worse, much worse. Yeah,
unregulated.
We don't have European funding, European help that puts things. Because Europe is strictly neoliberal. I don't think going back to Europe would help much, to be honest, but it's strictly neoliberal. The ECB runs fiscal credibility rules. It runs subsidy rules which ban state subsidies, has fiscal limits, 3% of GDP, useless. I mean, Europe's useless too, So what we need to get rid of those fiscal limits. We need massive public investment, first in energy. We need clean energy, even if the Chinese have developed thorium salt reactors coming online in a few years' time, which are clean energy. We've got huge coastline in this country. We can use combined with wind power, bit of fossil fuel to back up because the nuclear power stations can't throttle up and down very well. So the practical problems. We need that sort of thing. We need the NHS put right. We need some jobs. The modern monetary theory people who I know suggest a job guarantee program. I think that would be stigmatizing. So we should expand the public service, public works, and we should get people into jobs. We can go down to a 3-day week even because we have so many people idle, doing what David Graeber called bullshit jobs. We have to be doing proper jobs. The whole bloody country needs repaving. A child was killed not so far away from where I live a few years ago. Terrible tragedy because waterside trees, which are unstable, they tend to fall down in the dry rivers. It dropped on a child. It was awful because the council can't afford to come around and maintain the trees like they used to. We need all of this put right, practical things that working people can see in front of them happening. And we need jobs back. We need the utilities and services running properly at reasonable prices. There's been a drop in the energy prices over the last few days, and everybody's going, hey, this is great, So the Labour Party go up a couple of points in the polls. So we need to do things that people can see, practical things they can understand. It's no good talking about, Karl Mannheim and the Frankfurt School in the local council. We need to do practical things. We can talk about that. And I still have discussions about the, philosophy, Marxist philosophy as it developed through Lukács and others. I love talking about it. I'll talk for hours about it, but they're not interested. People are interested in that. What they're interested in are things happening.
Let me say one thing. There's another direction to the convincing that I think should take place based on your book, which is the convincing of the left. Because we've talked a lot about how the left can convince the working class, but how can we convince the left to recenter their politics in accordance to this vision? That's a question.
Yeah, that's very difficult because the left, the intellectual wing of the left,
I want to define what the left is. Like when we say what the left, how do you define that exactly?
Well, the left is difficult to define because it's a metaphor from the French Revolutionary Parliament, isn't it? The left-hand side of the Parliament. It's supposed to be people with social conscience who believe in society's needs before the needs of capital accumulation. But some conservatives were quite, in a sense, anti-capitalist, anti-industrialist. It was, people like Chesterton, Belloc, a lot of Catholics were against the Protestant way, this idea that you glorify God by creating wealth. But the left what is it? It's a mess. It's a big mess because it hoisted its anchor out of the economy. It just lifted its anchor and sailed off into a sea of J.P. Donlevy visionary, narcissistic visions. Every leftist has their own wonderful narcissistic vision. I'm sure they have imagery in their head of what this beautiful world looks like.
Well, I guess it's a reflection of the desire for personal liberation in a society at a time that afforded for a modicum of equality, that permitted a lot of rights, the sphere of rights, to be expanded, and they were expanded.
They were expanded, and that's a good thing up to a point. But then we have Foucault saying, don't we, that unlimited experience is the point of life, that we should have, that we should test it in that sort of Nietzschean way. We should test our lives and test our mettle by experiencing the absolute limits of and that horrifies working class parents, for instance. Now that very idea horrifies everyday people. It needn't horrify because I think Foucault was like playing games rather than doing anything serious. But it horrifies working people, and then you get this moral panic. Again, it's the left's problem. This is a problem of the left. So these narcissistic visions are of a world that suits their personal liberation. Build the world around me and my desires and my freedom. What I want to do and what I dream of doing. The freedoms I can enjoy. I don't think that's the way forward. Maybe the world will turn out like that. Maybe the world will be beautiful enough for everyone's freedoms, and we don't know. But at the moment, it needs to function. And if we don't convince people that it can function and create a platform to at least appease some of the terrible insecurity they're feeling at the moment around their livelihoods and their jobs, and what's going to happen next week. And we have geopolitical tension that's scaring everyone. We have a general, it's a Peter Turkin-esque, isn't it? This sort of Turkin-esque interregnum we're moving into, where things are very, very unstable. There's an American sociologist called Charles Thorpe, who wrote a book about the decline of the Keynesian welfare state, what we regarded for decades as normal times into post-normal times. We're living in post-normal times. It's an interregnum. We don't know what's going to happen. Unless we can convince people we can manage this, that we can create a platform of security, I don't think they're going to listen, Daniel. And I don't see any reason why they should. Do you?
Well, it used to be the argument that the working class is the revolutionary agent, but that conclusion, that claim, was based upon the Marxist, the deep political economic argument about the central role of the commodification of the labor power of the majority of the wage laborers that transcends different sectors. So it's not just industrial, but it transcends. It's that reliance on the commodification of labor power happens to be the ubiquitous lot of the vast majority of all of us in this society. And that's still true. That's still the case.
True.
It's still true.
But
now, that doesn't mean that organizing that class as one unified block will necessarily be revolutionary. But it does mean that social change can really only plausibly occur through activation of that class. You see my point?
No, I agree with that.
I think that's the central Marxist argument.
Yes, and that has to be because we are the majority. You know, the corny expression, we are many and they are the few. Of course, we know that. Yes. So
that's what the left needs to be convinced of, and I think that's doable.
I think it's doable, but we have to know who we're talking to. Goes back to my point of, we talked about a good while ago. We have to know who we're dealing with and how to persuade. Saskia Sassen, the sociologist, about 35 years ago, coined the term the mobile entrepreneurial worker. Jean Baudrillard, God bless him, was probably right. We no longer stand outside the factory gates en masse, do we? We're working in little cafes, and we're working for builders, and we're working on these awful program coding jobs for making silly apps that always go wrong. And we're doing all of these bullshit jobs, and we're doing all of this service work, and some of us are doing very important work, health service, all the rest of it. But we're no longer standing outside the factory gates where you can have someone on the podium shouting out up the workers and let's have a strike and let's have communism. We're not there anymore.
We can't do the mass line.
By a Welsh sociologist called Dan Evans. I forgot. Oh God, sorry, Dan. I've forgotten the name of your book, but it's a very good book about how we appeal to the local entrepreneurial builder who's just a working class guy who has to pretend to be bourgeois because he's got to get some work for his building firm and to provide jobs for the squads of masters and electricians who, you know what I mean?
And he's got no union. He's got no union.
No union. And this is the majority of working people in there's an awful guy in London. What was his name? He became an entrepreneurial plumber. And he looks like Rod Stewart. He's this awful guy with Botox and everything who set up a plumbing agency. He became a millionaire by finding plumbers work, squads of plumbers work in London. Now, they could have done that themselves through unionization, through setting up their own agencies.
Right.
The left has to look at all of this in detail. And who are people? What is the working class now? Where are they working? What do they need? How do we make their lives more secure? How do they get the work that they want to do? Are there alternatives? What about training, education and training? I mean, Britain has run down the state-funded education service, So if we need, good friend of mine, drummer, I used to be a journeyman musician. He's a very, very good jazz drummer. And he worked for the construction industry training board, going around schools, convincing people, kids to be electricians and all the rest of it. And he had an easy job because they were good jobs. We need electricians. We need people to fix your boiler when it breaks down in the winter. Without these people, we've had it. We have miserable lives. We must appreciate them. We must tell them that they're important, that they're doing great stuff, they're doing great jobs. If they want better training, then that has to be available. They need to earn money. That's the way things are at the moment. We're not in a moneyless society. We can have these beautiful visions about a moneyless society of local barter and community banks and all the rest. And they're great ideas. They're wonderful to sit so we can sit and talk about them at 2:00 in the morning. But it doesn't make it doesn't wash with people. Mm-hmm. We need detail about what they need, and we need to say that we can provide the platform on which this can happen. And there are certain things we need to do. And we need to promise based on very, very powerful central macroeconomic policies, as I've said, capital controls, how to beat the bond market, public investment, there's lots of other stuff that we need to talk about. We need to get back onto the ground again.
I had a question here because it's even though left populism may be dead, right populism may not be dead, because right populism succeeds off of the absence of the left having something compelling to say to workers. Because what you're talking about is abundance and dignity. We want to make your life better materially, and we want you to have a life that you're proud of, and you have social recognition, and you have dignified life. We can do that, right? Now, the right-wing populist doesn't need to say that because it's a resentment politics, and it's a lot easier for them. The rhetoric is a lot more intuitive, and that resentment is very hard for the left to confront. It's very hard for the left to confront that resentment, and I think that the left needs leaders that come from the working class that can know how to speak to that resentment differently. What would you say to that? And I also wanted to ask you about the Labour Party, but maybe later Yes.
Too depressing, damn it, the Labour Party. Yeah. No, that's why I'm in the Workers' Party in this country. We have a Workers' Party. Yeah, and we are working class people, a lot of
how's it going?
Not very well. But I don't want to say too much about that right now because we're undergoing change and we're trying to. We dropped out of the recent by-election to allow the Green Party to beat the populist right, to beat reform. That's the big populist right. I don't like this expression, right populism. It's nationalism. It's aggressive nationalism. Yeah, populisms are multifaceted. You had your own American Populist Party under William Jennings Bryan in the late 19th. That wasn't a hardline right-wing party.
It's right-wing demagogues.
Yeah, we have right-wing demagogues. Now, all they've got to say is that we will take you back to a time when you were on top of the immigrants. That's all they've got to say. We'll get rid of the immigrants, put the immigrants back in their places, and we'll have you back, the aristocrats of Labour, and we'll make sure that you're top dogs. That's all. It's a very easy message, Now, that is the wrong type of nostalgia. That is to move back to a specific point in time and rigidly occupy that space and then reproduce that space forwards. That's the wrong type of nostalgia, and that's a very easy message. So what we do is that we persuade as many on the left as possible, and I think that if you put together the liberal centre left, the old traditional left, and the hard left, they call us the hard left commies and all the rest of it. If you put all that together, I think that's a majority, don't you?
Sure. Yeah,
that's a majority. And to get over this hump, I think we've got to forget cultural differences, forget the fact that there was a colonial project. There was a colonial project. I don't think that was the origins of capitalism. I think that was the expansion of the capitalist project. Like, we can talk about that another time. But we need to forget that for the time being, and we need to focus on what makes this country and your country and each country, and what makes us as a set of countries in a trading bloc, because it looks as though the West is going to become a bit of more of a trading bloc.
What would you say to the people that would respond by saying you're advocating left-wing nationalism?
I think that I'm advocating left-wing internationalism as opposed to globalism. Internationalism, you've got to have nations, inter-nation, yeah? You've got to have nations, because I think Wolfgang Streeck's right, that the nation is the only feasible sized unit of political management. I think the world's too big, the world, and little, this anarchist notion of little communes where they all have moots every month to decide on how much porridge they're going to eat. That's too small. So we have these feasible units of, and nations are broken. America's so big, it's broken down into states, and I think they're feasible units of political. We have to think practically, we have to think pragmatically for the moment, because we need to construct a platform. Let's call it the platform of dreams. At the moment, we just have dreams with no platform. We don't have a bed to lie in. We're just floating around and talking nonsense and getting on everyone's nerves, getting on each other's nerves, because we're always arguing and we can't agree on anything. So we need to understand that we need political management. Also, the nation is the currency issuer. So unless we're going to have a Keynesian Bancor, a global clearing currency, which might happen one day, unlikely at the moment, because of the US. America likes the dollar as a reserve currency so it can get the rest of the world into debt, and buy its bonds, so it can so that they can develop their own sort of service to tech economy. But if we remember that we are also international, and that we have to work as an international unit, then we have to work in mutual aid so that we're helping each other develop. And that's, I think, the only way to do it. There are problems of manufacturing, of resources. Small countries don't have resources, other countries do. There's just, the old Ricardian notion of comparative advantage, etc. But there are huge problems, but we have to overcome these problems, and we can only do that from the point if we have democratic politics with national politics full of the representatives of the working classes, not the representatives of BlackRock and the bond markets. Yeah, we need the representatives of working people in politics, because at the moment we don't have that. In your country and mine, we don't have that. We have the representatives of what Michael Hudson calls the creditor class.
I've always wondered how you take the natural, spontaneous pride that workers have in their country, let's call it spontaneous patriotism, and how you might transform that by building class awareness and socialist unity. Because again, you don't want to penalize people for that feeling, because
you can't. No,
you can't. It's a self-defeating to do that.
If you do that, you'll simply, fuel it.
Exactly. Yeah. And I've always struggled how to manage that. I guess the answer is success. Success of your goals could override that bourgeois patriotism. I
think so. And I think also to encourage the celebration of the success of others.
Yes.
If we're all experiencing at least some sort of progress, some sort of development economically, making ourselves more stable, we don't have to make ourselves too much wealthier, because the GDP levels of America is huge. The problem is the distribution. And the problem is the fact that you're all workaholics. You only give each other 2 weeks a year holiday. It's ridiculous. and you need to stop that, and we need to. We could get.
Well, you're suggesting it's been a kind of consensus on. It's
It's
not been a consensus.
That's forced on you. Of course it is. If it's competitive, if you don't do it, someone else will.
Sure. Absolutely.
And we need to get rid of these cultural habits that have, they've made you rich, Daniel. They've made some of you rich. They've made some of you others quite comfortable. Most of you quite comfortable, and they've boosted your GDP and they've innovated. You've done, you're not doing so well now. Chinese are doing it all, but that's your problem because you're deindustrialized. But we must allow people to be comfortable in their own skins and comfortable in their own environments and comfortable about who they are, and stop pestering them and criticizing them about who they are, their identity. It's precious to people, I regard myself as Northern English. I'm quite proud of that. I'm quite proud of what my parents did, what my grandparents did. Not so proud about the colonial expeditions and the wars that the ruling class got us into, and the fact that we capitulated to this and rather than resisted. But there are things in everyday life we got by, and I'm quite proud of what my parents did for me and what my grandparents did for them. They worked hard and they looked after us. We have to allow people to feel good about themselves, And we mustn't threaten that, because sometimes it's all they have. What else have they got? They've just got insecure jobs, bloody mortgage to pay. That's what they've got. They don't have any great visions of the future. People are getting quite cynical, I think, about the future.
Right.
They see things as just, this is as good as it gets. It's just going to roll on like this. And the liberals like Fukuyama have reinforced that notion. So we must not destroy them for symbolically destroy the people like that. We've got to stop doing that, and we've got to look at notions like friendly rivalry, like sports teams, and we got to say, okay, well, we've got the Brits and they're a funny lot over there, and they have their own humor and they have their own ways of doing things, but we can coexist and we can help each other to exist better. With fair trade, with industrialization, maybe industrial specialism. We've got to use. Some countries are good at making some stuff, and others are. The Europeans tried that. The European Union did try to instigate that, but it was done rather badly. So, what do we do when automation takes over most of this anyway? Do we have a service economy reliant simply on going to the bank and trying to get a loan and set up a cafe somewhere, or do we have public funded services in which people, Roosevelt in the 1930s, if you remember, and his labor laws and his policies allowed Americans to get back into work, and they did start to claw America out of the Great Depression. It's a little known fact, but by 1937, which was the start of Roosevelt's second term after the first in 1933, the American murder rate was cut in half.
Wow.
Because remember all of these. I mean, they even had theatre companies, state-funded theatre companies. People like Orson Welles and John Cassavetes were products of the state-funded theatre companies. Art,
sure.
Music, culture. We can get people doing things, and we can fund this sort of stuff. And we can have small business startups. We can have public expansion of the public services. We can also leave room for small business people and traders, entrepreneurs, and tradesmen, particularly building and maintenance trades. We can do all of this. This is all doable. And we've done it before, not particularly well, but we can do it a little bit better next time round. Give ourselves a platform, give ourselves a chance to construct something that will, through which we can communicate with ordinary people and say, okay, we've got this. What do you want now? Let's try and improve this and make this better. If we don't do that, like I say, we're going to be a very interesting talking shop for the rest of history.
I really appreciate that, Steve. And I want to ask you a final question, if I might, since we've been going for about an hour and 40 minutes. It's been fabulous.
Yeah, you can edit all the crap out of this.
I will keep it all in.
I can guarantee you all the crap from me.
No. I very much appreciate your insights. I wanted to ask you a question, if you could maybe reflect. on the decades of your time in academia, as
Yeah,
based on what we know of who you are and your working class background and your
yeah,
politics, um, what advice would you give to scholars, academics, and intellectuals that may come from a similar background as you, and they
yeah,
face the academic world and all the it's not easy for a variety of reasons, but how do you make a difference within it, and how do you claw your way through it in a way where you keep your center, you keep your values,
mm,
you keep your perspective, and you fight, you put up a fight, you put up some type of scholarship that tries to reflect your perspective.
yeah.
How do you do that and not sell out? How do you, because you've
You've
done an
watched.
admirable job, I'd say. So what would you
Well,
say?
we've tried. We're still, our ultra realist project is still quite fringe, although we're managing to get articles published in the top tier journals a little more often. You have to look at the careers of people like Michael Parenti, I suppose, who manage James Petrus, who managed to, I don't know if they ever got tenured positions, but they managed to keep their ideals pure, maybe a little too pure for me. I think they might have, been a little more adaptable and flexible in their thinking over the years. Not too much, because I think their basic ideas were still quite sound. How did they do it? How did we do it? You basically have to be very, very tough and very forthright and incredibly productive, because no matter what you're saying, as long as it's not so fringe that it's, dismissed as far right conspiracy theory or whatever, as long as you don't go, completely over outside the boundaries, which, we've approached that. But I mean, just find out where the boundaries are first. What are the boundaries? You can push against them a little bit, and then you have to be productive. It has to be high quality. You have to apply research methods properly. Gather data. This is in social science, but what's your field? Is it humanities or social science or
Yeah, philosophy, humanities. Yeah, yeah.
philosophy? Now, well, don't ask me how to do it in philosophy. I would imagine by simply producing quality, cutting
Sure,
edge work, and
sure,
just produce quality
sure.
in your field. And there's something about academics when they see quality, and they don't see a lot of it. When they see quality, they'll push it through, even if it goes against the grain.
Mm.
And it's almost when Richard Nixon visited the USSR on his famous kitchen unit offensive in 1959. And the Russian, I'm sorry to be sexist, but they were actually housewives at the time. And it's all these wonderful kitchen units and cookers. And thought, oh, wow, they're beautiful. What we could do with those, all the wonderful things we could do in the kitchens like that. And Khrushchev was sitting there and said, we will bury you. We will. But that was, of course, misconstrued and thought nuclear weapons were on the way. But what he was saying is, we'll outproduce you. What you've got to do is outproduce them. And because a lot of the liberals aren't very good, to be honest, you can do that. You can produce quality work on the cutting edge. You can open up new avenues that they're just a little bit scared to touch and say, oh, what's happening here in philosophy? You could launch an attack on, postmodernism's dead anyway, but, take speculative realism by the collar and object orientated ontology and take a look at that and either push it forward or criticize it and create something new and do something productive. Not necessarily spectacular, because I think that's the wrong value, to be, but to do something that of quality, and then you get through, no matter who you are and what you're saying, you get through on quality and producing good work. And that's what we've done. We've basically worked ourselves into the bloody ground over our academic careers and produced what was judged in our research assessment exercises as top quality 4-star work. We were in a little provincial University, which was actually a good place to be. It was full of working class academics. It was a backwater, and we beat all of the big Russell Group, the equivalent of your Ivy League. We beat the Russell Group in the research assessment exercises.
Wow.
Because our stuff was better.
Wow.
And just do it better. That's just, you don't have to do it better all the time, but just do either better or as good, and you just be as good as them and outproduce them, and just get the quality and make it clear. Don't read too much Derrida. Make it clear. And what Nietzsche said, wasn't it? There's something to say, seek clarity. There's nothing to say, seek obscurity. Don't be too obscure. Make it clear, and say what you need, what you think needs to be said. And if you're in humanities, back it up with data. If you're in philosophy, back it up with concepts, with new concepts, better ideas, and just be as good or better than them. And that's the only way to do it.
Beautiful. No, very nice. I didn't realize you had so much to say on that topic. I'm very impressed.
There's a lot more to say, but because I was there for a long time, and they can be quite vicious in a civilized way. The iron fist in the velvet glove, liberal.
It seems, based on your work, that you got a lot of momentum through carving out the concept of ultra realism and building off of it, because it seemed like it created a kind of a field.
And we create our own field, which we knew how to operate, and that would be a wonderful thing to do. The speculative realists, who actually find quite interesting some of the speculative realists. I think object-oriented ontology was a bridge too far, but based on the tools work, wasn't it? And we've used some speculative realist stuff in our own work, because we are magpies. We bring in ideas and concepts from all over the place.
Well, it's also interesting that you say we. You don't say I.
No, we're a research program. We're a research network. I don't. They regard me as the grandfather, but I don't like being grandfather. So I just.
This is you and Simon Winlow.
Yeah. But no, we're a research network, and we do some superb. Tom Raymond, for instance, his book on the enigma of social harm, it's a criticism of liberalism's assumption of harmlessness, which was a critic of John Stuart Mill's sort of boundary, of the semiological boundary, And it's a fabulous piece of work, and a lot of hard. Well, we have a woman doing work on military veterans and the ones who are having a tough time in civilian life. It's more than with this commonly understood. And all sorts of, field that the field is alive. The field we've created is alive. It's alive with research. It's cutting edge. It's contemporary. It's looking for answers, and it's looking for things to tell people. And rather than simply seeking obscurity and seeking ideas that are limited to the seminar rooms and the conferences, we're looking for ideas that can branch out and maybe not impact on policy, because I think we're too fringe for that. But there's certainly an awful lot of lay people who read our books and get a lot out of them. So we have the book you read is what we call, I don't know if you use the same term in America, it's a trade publication, which goes out cheaper, and it's written in a more accessible. Because some of the other stuff is very highfalutin and complicated. But that one you read we've written another one called The Rise of the Right, which is about the rise of this sort of national populist sort of thing a few years ago, which is another trade publication. And Simon's book, Politics of Nostalgia, and the new one, Facing the Future, he's writing, they're all trade publications. So we try to branch out. A lot of the stuff our researchers produce can be read by lay people and understood too. So
even the academic stuff,
I don't see any mileage in being deliberately obscure.
And the establishment thinks you're fringe because why is that? Is that because the foundation of your ideas come from the left?
No, because the foundation of our ideas challenge most of the domain assumptions on which social science is based. Moral panic being one of them, seems, which is, so we challenge domain assumptions and where they need challenge. And we don't do it to be deliberately awkward, we do it where if they need to be challenged. If someone's been claiming something for 40 years, which is complete crap. Then we need to, and also we challenge some concepts, and we do that in a more sophisticated, for instance, authoritarian populism. Does it exist? No, probably not. What actually does exist? The civilizing process, Norbert Elias, his actual pronunciation of his name was Norbert Elias, but he got so sick of people calling him Norbert Elias in England that he started calling himself Norbert Elias, which is a remarkable adaptability. No, but we challenge ideas like, so we had a replacement for the civilizing process. We call it a pseudo-pacification process. We don't think, because we don't think civilization was what was the teleological purpose of that longue durée cultural process. So we challenge these, and just by challenging them and providing new ideas, then people read it, and I think maybe they're right, Maybe they're right. We don't like them very much, but maybe they're right.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wrote my second book for a trade press, and it was a philosophy book, but it was really, half of it was on Nietzsche, the philosopher, but the second half was very much about issues of contemporary politics and socialism and working class issues. And anyways, I critique a very, very prominent liberal philosopher, but I'm a little bit too junior for that critique.
Nobody's junior.
Well, I mean, in the hierarchy of the world, it's like,
yeah, but fuck the hierarchy. I mean, you say what you believe. You see, what we faced as working class academics was a permanent hierarchy, a hierarchy through which we could not move. So we had to ignore it. We had no choice but to ignore it. If you're middle class in England, because the academia is a middle class hobby, as we all know, then you have a much better chance of rising up through that hierarchy, because you carry what Pierre Bourdieu calls cultural capital, the French.
It's very, I spoke to Lisa McKinsey. I don't know if you know her.
Oh, no, Lisa, yeah. I know Lisa well, yeah.
She's been on my program.
Yeah.
And I have the feeling that because the British class system is so much older, so much more defined, you bring these you just said these statements about academias. No American would ever say what you just said.
No,
because Americans don't think in terms of class.
No, they think in terms of status. You've just expressed it in status. So you think Weberian, don't you? This is Max Weber's notion of status hierarchies. But effectively, Daniel, it's the same thing in academia. It's just because you regard it as status and we regard it as class. It doesn't make an awful lot of difference. It still means your life's tough. You don't have the status. And what you have to do...
no, I'm sorry. I'm suggesting the Americans disavow. I'm suggesting that the reality still is classed in America, but Americans don't acknowledge it.
Yeah. They see it in terms of status. Yeah. And of course it's class. It boils down to class. But what in Britain, if you're working class, you're not going to rise up to be the professor at Oxford or Cambridge, even though I'll say this, and I don't care if any of them listen. In fact, I hope they are. And if you are, hello. Yeah, the Cambridge and Oxford. Yeah. We are producing stuff that is literally 10 times more sophisticated than anything come out of Cambridge or Oxford criminology or Harvard or criminology. All right, you heard that. They know that because they've read it and they're terrified of it. Yeah, but they still wouldn't give me a job at Oxford or Cambridge. They're just not in a million years. They would keep me marginalised in the post-92, and I was quite happy there. In fact, that university I worked at won University of the Year award last year because of the sterling work it does educating local working class people. And I was quite happy to work there because I think that's a more noble cause. It's a better cause. And I was working with people I knew and people who I get on with. And Simon, I think, feels... In fact, Simon had a job in the Russell Group University and demoted himself to our university to come and work
Wow.
on this project. And he did that out of all good. And I love him to bits, Simon, and we've been friends for a long time, and we help each other out, And he's a great guy. But you can do this. We can't, like I say, I'll repeat that because I think it's worth. The hierarchy exists there, and we have no choice but to ignore it, because we're not going to break into it. There was no way that we'd ever break into it. And we knew that from the very beginning.
But it is a quite passive aggressive one, because I'll bet you that the bourgeois counterparts won't acknowledge what you are accusing them of, which is this, behavior.
They're
they won't acknowledge that they do it.
No, they can't be the authoritarians that they hate. Oh no! I mean that they would hate themselves so much that they would start to be, they would get seriously depressed if they could see themselves for what they are, incredible authoritarians. And this is what the contrarian Marxists get right. I don't like to admit that people like Spike Online sometimes get things right, but this liberal authoritarianism is a thing, and it's a very powerful institutionalized means of ordering the British society. I don't know if it works exactly the same over there, over the pond, but it works like that in Britain. They're incredibly passive aggressive. In fact, they are the doyens of the pseudo pacification process, as we understand it. It is a sort of a passive. This is how violence was turned into aggressive competition. And this is why Britain, it's an English thing. This is why England invented most of the world's sports. and to teach people to be passively, to be aggressive within the limits of harmful violence.
I see. Well, Professor Hall, thank you very much for joining me and for this very illuminating conversation. We covered a lot of ground. I'm sure there's much that I didn't ask, and I apologize if I neglected anything, but I feel like we touched at least the main things I wanted to touch in the book. Do you have plans for part 2?
Well, we're writing a book called Facing the Future at the moment, which sort of is part
of part 2.
Yeah.
I had a feeling that this, the energy of this book is pretty profound, so I'm not surprised to see you continue it.
I'm becoming a bit of an economist at the moment. I'm delving deeply into. I've got an article out in a book written by working class academics, edited by Deirdre O'Neill from London, based at the Journal of Class and Culture, which is they're all working class academics. I've got a chapter about working class economics, how we must beat the bond markets, the money markets, that's coming out soon. So I think that's important for people to understand. I'm blathering on about, you might have seen me on Twitter blathering on about the money markets and the bond markets and how we beat them now and again. And I think that's the next important step. So in facing the future, we must look at start looking forwards again from this situation that we're in now, this quite difficult situation in now, and start to formulate some moves to move into the future. And if we can do that incrementally, I don't think there's going to be a revolution. But I have been known to be wrong. So we'll just maybe leave that on there.
Well, we wish you the best. Thank you so much for joining me today. All the best.
Thanks very much, Daniel. Cheers. Thanks. Nice talking to you.
Take care.